Greg, I want to play you a little bit of what James Cleverly said. He's the British Foreign Secretary, a little bit of his analysis and his urging of Israel in terms of its response. Have a listen.
Well, I've said that restraint, discipline, these are the hallmarks of the Israeli Defence Force that I want to see. They have every right, and we support this right, to protect themselves. Whilst doing it, we've said do everything you can to minimise civilian casualties, do everything you can to prevent Hamas getting what they want, which is this to escalate into a wider regional conflict.
So the civilian point is one, but then the supplementary point about the broader conflict, the warning that's what Hamas wants. How likely, Greg, is that wider conflict?
I think there's a very strong chance of that, Kieran. Probably, I would say less than 50%, but a very strong chance. Israel doesn't want a broader regional conflict either. Israel doesn't want to be fighting on two fronts, with Gaza in the south and Hezbollah in Lebanon in the north, and maybe with Syria in the north, and maybe with the Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, and maybe with the Houthi rebels firing rockets at them from Yemen, and maybe with Iran engaged. Israel doesn't want that. Israel's very powerful, but it's not, it's not super Godzilla or anything. But on the other hand, so I applaud Cleverly's remarks, and he, like Biden, has shown great solidarity with Israel. Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly went there, and much more quickly than our government, they grasped the enormity of what Hamas did in Israel. But it's difficult to see how Israel can destroy Hamas and yet not produce civilian casualties, particularly because Hamas wants to hide amongst civilians. Hamas wants to prevent civilians from fleeing combat zones. I think it's reasonable for Cleverly and Biden and so forth to call for the Israelis to exercise what restraint they can. But on the other hand, Israel has evacuated southern towns, it's evacuated northern towns, it's called up 300,000 or 400,000 reserves. You can't do that very often, even in an economy as wealthy and powerful as Israel's. This has the look to me as like something that could be very, very big indeed. Israel has not evacuated southern towns and northern towns previously, and it has to make a response which convinces its enemies not to do this again, or it has to make it physically impossible for its enemies to do this again. And its enemies are Hezbollah and Hamas are both under Australian law regarded as terrorist organisations. They both have theological, eschatological aims. They're in love with death. They don't mind their own people dying. This has the ingredients, Kieran, of something that's very, very big and very ugly. And I think Biden is doing his best to support Israel, but to try to keep the situation under control.
The general in charge of Central Command has arrived in Tel Aviv. That US general, you've got those aircraft carrier groups that you spoke about. You've got the president visiting. The US so preoccupied with the Middle East. I wonder, just to shift our focus, does this give China basically more strategic space to do as it sees fit?
It certainly does, Kieran, and that's one of the very serious results. I mean, I can remember a year or two ago writing a column saying the central strategic fact of our time is the de facto alliance of China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. And if you had a crisis in Europe, which you've got with Ukraine, which is draining a lot of American resources, quite rightly, to help the Ukrainians, if you then had a simultaneous crisis in the Middle East centred on Iran, which is what you've got now, Iran using all of its proxies to attack Israel and requiring massive US naval intervention, and the US has readied 2,000 troops, mainly medical people, to go in and help if necessary, then the US is pretty stretched at that point, and that may well be the point at which China says to itself, well, you know what, the alignment of circumstances is never going to be more favourable for us to take very, very strong action on Taiwan. I'm not saying they will do that, but they'll certainly be making those calculations. The US is fully stretched elsewhere. The rest, the Western arsenal is exhausted in supplying weapons to Ukraine and Israel. and this axis is working hand in glove. You know, Vladimir Putin is in Beijing even today. The reports are that the North Koreans have given thousands of tons of weapons to the Russians, no doubt sold them. So I think it's a very real possibility that China may see this as a propitious time to take very aggressive action in the Indo-Pacific.
Greg Sheridan, thanks as always.
Thanks, Kieran.